We think we're exceptional. Why are we exceptional? We're not. We're only as good as we are today. As I tell people, they go, well, what about the founding fathers? I say they're all dead. We are as good as we decide to be or as mediocre as we allow ourselves to be. And it starts again every day. And that's the thing about it. We coast a little bit. We can't imagine that we could go the way of the Weimar Republic and drift into National Socialism. We say it's impossible. We're America. Who knows what could happen? What we do know is that there's nothing guarantees the success of our democracy. We earn
it every day.
That's right. Exactly.
Thank you for being here, General McChrystal. Congratulations on this book. This is it's a very different book than your other book, which I thought when I first started reading it, I was wondering where it was going, and then you get into it and you realize that we're starting to get inside your head and really see who you are.
Kind of disappointing when you get in there, isn't it?
Well, no, it's actually, I was like, it was incredibly inspirational. But the place that I want to start with is actually the dedication. And the dedication is with admiration for all those who live a life of character and with the encouragement to all of us who fall short but continue to try. And I think about myself all the time. I think about my kids who remark about how I fall short all the time. And so what I wanted to start with is, what is that, when you think about character and you think about that process of defining a character and evaluating yourself as you fall short, I think it would be helpful to start with not only how you see character, but that process of evolution of character.
Yeah, well, thanks for having me, and thanks, everybody, for taking the time to let me talk to you today. I think, as people have said for a long time, I think character is a journey for all of us. I'm 70 now, and so I'm at a certain point in that journey, much closer to the end than the beginning, but that gives me a lot of opportunity to think about what I've seen. So to sort of go back, we don't have a really common definition of character. We use the term, but I think we often use it differently. And when I think of character, I think it's the essence of who we are. You take all of the other things, the external things, the physical things, they exist, but they don't matter. The character is. And character is best measured by what we do, not by what we say or what we write. It's what we actually do. And so as I started to think about this, because earlier in my life, if you'd asked me about character, I'd say, yeah, it's important. And then if you'd say, what is it? I'd have stammered for a while. And so as I worked on this book, I tried to define it. And I came up with a mathematical equation, because I was trained as a civil engineer, and not a very good one. And what I came up with is character is actually the product of our convictions, our deeply held beliefs, not the things that we just sort of superficially accept, but the things we've thought about, we've pressure tested, things we're willing to live to or die for. They're your values. And then the other part of the equation is the discipline we have to live to that. And because that means that if you've got the best convictions in the world, but you don't have any discipline, anything times zero is zero. So your character is zero. And so when I think about character at large, I think that it's the defining, at the end of the day, it's the defining aspect of who we are. And we're not going to take anything else with us. And so if we go back to the philosophers and we think about character, and I was exposed to philosophers when I was young, but if you're like me, you sort of glossed over it. Then I've started going back and reading, and they were actually pretty thoughtful people. Yeah. I now give them credit for that. But what it means is there's something there that I think we have allowed to slip from our minds on an individual level and on a societal level. We just don't put character as central on judging someone.
Mm-hmm. When was the first time you really thought about your character being tested?
Yeah. again, if you'd asked me when I was younger, I would have said that when I went through certain things, experiences in life, I went to West Point when I was 17. You know, it was 1972. West Point was 170 years old, and they hadn't changed much in that 170 years. I had my own ideas about how West Point ought to be run, and they were different from theirs. And so I had a really difficult period for the first 2 years. Almost got thrown out for bad conduct and poor grades. And I would have said that that tested my character. In retrospect, it didn't, but it certainly scuffed me up a bit, which did teach me some lessons. Later, as life went on, and I started to do things for which I was more responsible. When I was leading troops in combat, you make a decision and send people to do something that is inevitably going to get a certain percentage of them wounded or killed. And suddenly you start to say, okay, how am I going to make that decision? What are the components? And part of it is your military experience, your expertise, the intelligence, and part of it is your character. Part of it has to be that value set. And I started to realize that that was really important, particularly when things don't work out. How do you respond? And then, of course, the most famous moment in my life, which we might as well go on and get to, for those of you who remember, in June of 2010, an article came out in Rolling Stone magazine. And I didn't even have a subscription. If I did, I would have canceled it. But I was commanding in Afghanistan. I was 4-star general, 34 years of service. I'm commanding, and a freelance reporter doing an article for Rolling Stone writes an article that we thought was going to be a puff piece about my command group. Just talk about these guys have been together for a number of years at war, and, you know, aren't they good people? And the idea was we had to do media to get support for the war because it was pretty weak at that point. And
This is pre-surge. This is
this is post-surge.
This is post-surge.
Yeah, this is spring of 2010. And we had done the surge, and so they were in the middle of executing it. And still, there was a lot of conflicted feelings. People had been tired of Iraq. They were now tired and frustrated because Afghanistan was not going as well as it had in early years and people hoped. So this article comes out with the title of The Runaway General, which isn't good. And, you know, I'm surprised by the article, but as soon as I read it, I go, okay, this is going to be a political firestorm. So I called Chairman of the Joint Chiefs, I called the Secretary of Defense just to say, okay, so I've read it. And then that afternoon, I flew back to Washington, D.C. to meet with the President. Now, I'd been in Afghanistan for a little over a year at that point, but I'd been in combat for 6 of the last 7 years. And I fly back to the United States, which is an overnight flight all night. And I arrived there in the morning and put my dress uniform on, going to see the president. And I had a good relationship with President Obama, still do. But I go in, he says, okay, what's the story here? And I said, I don't know, actually. I haven't had time to investigate it, but I accept responsibility because as the commanding general in theater, my job is not to put problems on your desk. And so here's my resignation. If you want to accept it, I'm fine with that. If you want to say no, go back and continue your job, I'm fine with that too, whatever's best. So the president accepts my resignation, and in that instant, I'm sitting in the Oval Office. In that instant, I'm not the commander in Afghanistan. I'm not a 4-star general. I'm not even a soldier anymore. And I've been a soldier since I was 17 at that point. And my father and grandfather, all my brothers were soldiers. So everything that I was at that moment just stops, or seemed to. So I leave the Oval Office and, you know, obviously a little bit in shock. How do you process this? What do you do now? I never thought about it. I thought I could be killed. I thought I could be fired for incompetence. I never thought I'd be even questioned about an issue like this. So it is that moment when you say, okay, who am I? And you have grave doubts about who am I, because you've sort of been stripped clean of all those things which gave you confidence, your rank, the respect you had, the bona fides, all that. So I drive back across Washington, D.C. to where my wife Annie was living in quarters. And she knew I'd flown back all night to this meeting, but she didn't know what the outcome was going to be. And I go in the front door of the house, and she comes out of the back, the kitchen area. And I said, Annie, it's over. The president accepted my resignation. And she looked at me and she goes, good. I said, all right. And then she says, we've always been happy and we'll always be happy. And so the punchline of the story, or the moral of the story is, in an instant, one person reminded me what was important, reminded me that I was still a person. Obama hadn't taken that away, couldn't, because the soldier's in the uniform, not on it. And so we faced forward, not back. Because you can spend the rest of your life being a bitter general if you want. That is a job title. And people will have you out to lunch and listen to your story, but they don't care.
Right.
And so, but what she did was she set the azimuth for the rest of our lives. And, as I always tell people, Annie lives life like she drives with no use for the rearview mirror. And so, but it was the best thing in the world. And so it's not a question of I showed great character in that moment. I don't claim that. I offered my resignation not because I was brave and it was a hard decision. It was an obvious decision.
But is it? And the reason I ask is it is, I think, in these times where if we ask ourselves about that decision point, which I think, I applaud you for taking, it is a testament to who you are, to have that responsibility for troops. But I think we look at our society today and we ask, would people have the courage, the character, the discipline, the convictions around that? And I think we're many times left wanting. We have lots of question marks about that. And so how do you think about the people that are in those leadership roles now and the courage to sacrifice the level of service that you have achieved in those similar moments?
This is where I think we don't think and talk about it enough. A couple of examples that I think inspired me. And I wouldn't think they weren't front of mind, but I worked for a guy named Bill Garrison. He commanded Joint Special Operations Command during the operations in Mogadishu. And you remember the October 3-4, 1993 firefight. 18 Americans are killed. Big firefight. It was viewed as this big disaster. And as people are trying to figure out and make political hay out of this thing, he's called in to testify, and they say, well, did you ask for tanks? Did you ask for support aircraft and whatnot? And General Garrison, he's a Texas guy, and I just admire him to death. He said, stop it. Don't worry about what I asked for. I was the commander on the ground. We got in a firefight. I am responsible for the consequences of that firefight, period. And they kept trying to pull him into implicating whether the SecDef or somebody had let him down. And he just says, no, I was in command. I was responsible. And I think about that. And then I go to James Stockdale, the naval aviator who was shot down in 1965, spent 7 years in the Hanoi Hilton, and got the Medal of Honor for his courage. Now, he broke under torture, because everybody does. But what he did was he had a set of values, some of which were faith-based, some of which were philosophy-based, some of which were just, sense of self, that allowed him to navigate that kind of horrific situation for so long and keep a sense that he was responsible for his conduct and his dignity. They could take everything else away, but they couldn't take that unless he gave it. And so when your point, DJ, is so valuable, I think a lot of leaders forget that, they've been given position, maybe it brings wealth, maybe it brings power, maybe it brings prestige. But all of those come with accepting responsibility. And you've got to be able to accept responsibility, whether it's your fault or not. And I'm not sure I don't think we celebrate that enough, and I'm not sure we punish the lack of it enough. I think we give social media likes and votes and money to people who don't display that. And
Or we laud people when they weasel out of things.
We do.
And
That's right.
they get out of it. So when you think about, if you'd be willing to share how you came up with some of your values and and I ask that from a perspective of the advice that you tell or give others in their journey to assess, because you give the equation, but how do you find those components of the equation, like establishing what your values are?
It's interesting because in retrospect, this is how I think I arrived to my values, and they are not perfect, nor do I have discipline to be perfect at it. I'm first to tell you, and she'll be the second. But the reality is that it started with my parents, and my father was a soldier, married a young Southern girl, deep South, right near the end of World War II. And then they went through a 22-year marriage till my mom died when she was 45, suddenly with 6 kids. And my father, still a pretty young brigadier general, died, or was left with this family. I never once saw either of my parents do anything wrong, ever. I never saw them take a parking place they shouldn't have. I never saw them get a good deal when somebody gave them the wrong change back and keep it. I never saw them do a wink and a nod. If they did, none of the kids ever saw it. I never saw them fight. I never saw them talk badly about people, the neighbors or something like that. Now, they weren't perfect people, and they didn't sit us down and preach about values to us. They just lived that way. And so you've got that example. And then I wanted to be my father desperately. He was a combat infantryman, and I was never in combat with him. He was in Vietnam or Korea. But I had a vision of what he was there. And so even afar, he's this example that set a bar. And then you have a bunch of experiences as you go through life. I mentioned going to West Point. And West Point's very overt about the idea of character. There's statues, there are paintings, the buildings are named for heroes, typically heroes of pretty good character, never perfect, pretty good. And the idea of duty, honor, country is really hammered into you. And, a lot of West Point graduates don't do very well in life, but the idea is that in that 4-year experience, if they can sort of force you, immerse you, marinate you in that a bunch of that's going to become habit. And I think to a great degree, that worked. And then I came out and I went through my career and I had some really good bosses. I had a few bad ones, and you learn in all those cases. I tried almost every different leadership technique as I went on. I didn't come out of West Point a certain kind of leader and then be that. I tried different things, and I think that's true of a lot of people. You try to be George Patton one day, you try to be, the real easygoing person the next day. You're just trying to see what fits. And then you go a little bit, as you get a little bit further, you start to realize this is actually me. And if you reinforce that with this is actually me, it can be good. Now, if actually you is not good, that's a bad thing. But I think I got better as the years went on, and I was reinforced by people like General Garrison, who I described, as I was trying to learn leader and learn character. And then as you get into more difficult situations, you have a number of, I used to call them Plutarchian moments, when you get to make big decisions. And you usually get time to agonize them over them first, but if you get them wrong, almost instantaneously, you know that you did. I've got several regrets, or I've got a bunch of regrets from my life, but I've got a few where I just didn't take care of subordinates like I should have. And it wasn't unconscious. I went through this whole calculation, then I made a decision that if I could go back now, I'd do it differently. But that's part of learning. And the key thing is, I think if you take all those on board and you start to say, okay, what character do I really want? That's
Well, that's the part of the where it's interesting is because you, from early on, went into a system.
Yeah.
And much of the public, many of the people listening, their system might be early education. Some people may not have the family structures that they have. People are jumping into corporations.
Right.
Lots of questions about the character, the value of those corporations. And so what I'm interested in that of is that guidance or the lessons, and there's a theme through the book, just to be clear for everyone that's out there, then why you should read it, is how you distill what you are in those values and that journey and the advice you have for people to say, hey, you know what? Instead of it taking this amount of time, we can cut the timeline in half so that your character is on trajectory and we get you there faster.
Yeah. I think that the observation you make about being part of a system is really important. And I'll start back at West Point. They have a really strict honor code. A cadet will not lie, cheat, steal, or tolerate those who do, which means that if you lie, cheat, and steal, you're out. If you know another cadet lied, cheated, or stole, and you don't report them, you're out. Even if you had nothing to do with it except knowing, you're out. And that made West Point a pretty honest place. But on the other hand, there were violations, but generally it was incredibly honest. But the idea was to make it a habit when you go out in life. Then when you get out into the Army had values, but there was conflicted values. When I first got in the Army, infidelity to spouses was rampant. And when people used to say, what happens TDY stays TDY, which is temporary duty. So units would go places, and it would be really common. And, you'd kind of watch it, and you'd go, okay, that's kind of what you do. I'm in this organization. I should adopt the values of this organization. But then if you think more about it, you go, well, it doesn't actually seem right, because that involves lying to somebody. And the way I used to say, if somebody's willing to lie to their spouse, why do I think they're not willing to lie to me? And then there was the alcohol and whatnot, which was not evil, but there was another side, and there were a bunch of aspects to it. I had a commander who was very righteous. He was always talking about, other people, and you got to do XXX. And then at the end of a quarter, we had re-enlistment goals that the battalion had to make. And so there was always great pressure on commanders to re-enlist. And this is the 1970s. It was hard to get people to re-enlist. And there'd be great pressure to make it. So we had a soldier in our company who we had barred from re-enlistment. That means the soldier is so bad that you prohibit them from re-enlisting. And in those days, you had to be pretty bad to be prohibited. I mean, this guy was a train wreck. And so we're the last day of the quarter. I'm a company XO, and I get to work early. I get to work a little bit before 6 o'clock. And the first sergeant's there, and he is beside himself. And he goes, Lieutenant Mack, you're not going to believe this. I said, what? He said, battalion commander this morning at about 5 had somebody come down, get soldier X, bring him to the battalion headquarters, lift the bar to re-enlistment, and re-enlist the guy to make quota.
Wow.
And everything that, he was saying about all these other things was just, go, holy shit. The gap between what he says and what he does is a chasm. And I saw a lot of that through my career, but particularly in those early years. And at first you go, wow, would I do that if I was in his position? And you want to say, I'd never do that. You hope you never would, but there's great pressure.
So I want to come back to that in just a second, because I think that dovetails in a lot of current events today. But I just wanted to really press you on the advice that you give to people on how to find the values.
Yeah. I think the first now is people should do a lot of thinking about it. I don't think we think very much. I think most of us don't. In fact, a quick example, a friend of mine talked to a bunch of his friends after the State of the Union address. So he said, what'd you think of it? And they all had an opinion. And then he said, well, how'd you feel watching it? And every one of them said, well, I didn't watch it. so how do you think about it? And he said, well, so-and-so talked about it, or pundit, well, you know.
They
boom,
listen
boom.
to the podcast version.
Yeah, exactly. And so we are just regurgitating ideas that people have given us and just spouting them out. And so how often have we actually really come back and said, I really thought that one hard. I've done a dialectic on it. I've taken opposing ideas and I've tried to really wrench this thing down to decide what I think. And I think that it starts with that. And then as you try to say, okay, what are my convictions on that? What do I actually think is right or wrong? Because if you don't have that clear, you can rationalize your way into doing a lot of pretty bad things. And we see that all the time now. Somebody does something, very public figures, and then they come out and they go, well, you know, my rationalization is this person is totally unsuited for this office, but, you know, he's got a nice dog. That'd be just great. And I think they almost have gotten themselves into believing it. So I think the thinking part is key. And then you need a sanity check. You need some set of values or some set of people or an example that you compare it against. Now, with your expertise, you could use it for AI. I mean, you could use AI to do that, because AI could actually come back and pressure test your ideas. Or you can do people that you know a lot. I've got a test that I use my 3 granddaughters. I got these 3 granddaughters, Emmylou, Elsie, and Daisy, and they live next door to us. And they're 11, 8, and 5. And they are hell on wheels. But the reality is, what they think of me, even after I'm gone, is very important to me. So what they know about me from seeing and hearing me, what they read about me, what other people may have written or said about me, I want all of those things to triangulate so they're not ashamed. And hopefully they're proud. But you need something that is a forcing
Like you
function.
need like a backstop and a pressure.
You do.
So like let's take this in a direction of you know, you've also post military service, you've had a lens on the corporate world.
Yeah.
There's been lots of questions about the corporate world. You know, here in Silicon Valley,
Right.
we're especially apt to the disruptive model of things.
Right.
And you hear about all sorts of questions about how people operate. We have, you know, we could go through a litany of,
Right.
of discussions, many of which have been litigated here on this stage, you know, of an engineer is told to do something that they know is wrong. People
Right.
know that they are specifically going to take actions that actually material cause harm to a population or a group. And they know they shouldn't do it. They do it. They
Right.
feel the pressure. They don't have those things. Everyone's talking about how do we create responsibility. They think
Right.
about ethics. You've seen this from a lens of the entire, not just, you know, Fortune, you know, global, multi-global kind of companies. And so what I think it'd be really interesting to hear from you is how, when in your corporate lens, you view these different aspects, and how do you see, and for the engineers or the young people who are in a company,
Right.
how do they do what's right and to be in that model where their family isn't ashamed of them?
Right. It is one of the hardest challenges because it's such a slippery slope. I think of 2015, I was invited to go speak to the Juul Corporation. Those are the electronic cigarettes. And so I went out and I sat down with the 2 founders, Stanford grads, smart guys, and they explained to me that what they were doing was creating an alternative to cigarettes, that this alternative would deliver nicotine, but because the carcinogenic or cancer-causing effect of cigarettes comes from the burning tobacco, the smoke going in, this would have no ability to create cancer. Now, you would stay hooked on nicotine, but that doesn't kill you. And so their theory was they were going to protect millions of people from the dangers of smoking, but still let them have the ritual, the pleasure of smoking. And they created very clever products. And I remember I sat down with them, I gave a leadership talk to their combined leadership, and I came home and I talked to Andy and I said, I am really taken by this. These guys are onto something because they are actually doing well by doing something good. That's a great thing. But the story doesn't end there. My interface with them did. What happens is they become very popular, the electronic cigarettes. They start marketing candy and other flavored versions, which bring in an entire new constituency of future smokers, young people, and they make a ton of money in that process.
They unwound 20 years of public health.
Exactly.
20 years of moving the ball forward.
And so all of these people, not all of these, but many of their employees had joined it with the idea, I'm doing something good. Then a big tobacco company decides to take a 35% stake in the company, which is billions of dollars. So now all of these employees are in this position because now with big tobacco buying it, it's pretty obvious what's happened here, where this thing is going. So all these employees are in this position, wow, it's a ton of money, but I actually feel it's wrong. Most of them stayed.
Do you think that they were, and I ask this from the perspective of you were on the front lines dealing with people who are radicalized.
Right.
They fall into a trap of believing something. And do you think that people in these organizations, they are radicalized to that view, delusional to that view, or do they actively actually understand what's happening and are just going along because the net outcome is one that benefits and aligns with some future outcome of theirs?
Yeah, it's interesting. I think that both cases are true. I actually have more sympathy for the people who are actually radicalized.
Wow.
As we fought against the terrorists of Al-Qaeda in Iraq and other groups, there were some of them that were some of these people were just absolute believers. And they were willing to kill for that, and they were willing to die for that. And to a certain degree, I've got a sympathy for that because they actually believe. To me, the greatest evil is the opportunist who knows better. The person who actually knows this isn't right, but they rationalize and they articulate. And they go, there are a bunch of arguments you hear. Well, if I don't do it, someone else will. Mm-hmm. It'll be worse without me here. There are all kinds of things. I can maybe make it a little better if I stay here and do it. We see that in all walks in corporate. We see it in government. We see it in other things. And so the danger is that we rationalize or we may never convince ourselves, but we try to convince other people. And to me, that's what we accept way too often.
What that role, that part, many times people could take that moment and resign.
Right.
People could take responsibility.
Right.
Do you have advice, because somebody out there listening, maybe somebody here in this
Yeah.
audience, is in that moment deciding which road to take?
Harold K. Johnson was the Chief of Staff of the United States Army in the early years of the Vietnam War. Some of you probably remember him. And he had this moment, and Annie's father was his executive officer in the Pentagon, and he disagreed with President Johnson's policy on Vietnam at that point, and he disagreed with what General Westmoreland was doing, who was in country. And he made the decision he needed to resign. So he ordered a car one evening, because they worked late, and he had the car drive him to the White House. But instead of going to the White House, when they got there, he had the car circle the White House, go back to the Pentagon. He decided not to resign. And he's decided that if he did resign, it would be a 1 or 2 day story. They'd get another general, things would move on, it wouldn't make a difference. But he spent the rest of his life questioning his decision to do that. And he was a courageous guy. He was a Bataan Death March survivor. He's a combat veteran from Korea as well, so he's a really stalwart person, but he made the decision in that moment not to. Now, you can never get in his soul to know why he did that or why he didn't, but I think if someone's in that moment, what I would urge you and what I think I've taken from my life is, when I make the long-term decision on what is right for me, what the person in the mirror is going to think 5 or 10 years from now, that's the more important metric. That's the one I can actually live with, even if it costs me something in the near term. And I think people sometimes if you haven't been in that moment, it's hard to understand just how hard it is, because not only are you giving up something for yourself, you're giving up something for your family. There's a lot of second and third order effects that are
Right.
hard to repair.
Well, before we go to questions,
Yeah.
because you can imagine where a lot of these questions are going to take us.
Sure.
I want to talk a little bit about what you're seeing in technology, and specifically because you are the first military commander that I think of who had to deal with the really abrupt change in technology. The way Al-Qaeda was recruiting, online, like the beginning of online news, if what you might call today the early attempts of misinformation, disinformation. And so I'd love for you to talk a little bit about that, as well as that we're about to see an abrupt new change with AI, and how you think about these different components as you've sort of looked at this,
Yeah.
not only fight, but the challenges that come with it.
Yeah. 99.9% of the technological expertise and wisdom is on this side of the stage. But I'll tell my story. I grew up, I joined an army in the 1970s. It was more like a World War II army than anything we have now. And so the first parts of my career, things were very analog and what you'd see from war movies and whatnot. When I took command of our counter-terrorist forces, Joint Special Operations Command, in 2003, a couple of things happened. We ran into an entirely new kind of enemy, organization called Al-Qaeda in Iraq, that had a completely different operating model. And we didn't know that until we really started the fight against them. And their operating model was based on information technology. And I don't think it was intentional. I think they just all had cell phones and access to the internet, so they automatically did it. But it made them faster, they learned better, it helped their leadership, it reduced their vulnerability. It was extraordinary what it did, and for a couple of years they were defeating us, even though we were the best counter-terrorist force in the world, easily. We're in a force, when I take it, that is well-resourced, but we've been running plays for years. We've developed old Vince Lombardi's power sweep from the early 60s, and we're really good at it. And then we get a number of pieces of technology that change our capability. One is unmanned aerial vehicles. One is night vision proliferated for everybody. Another is information technology, so we could talk to all of our soldiers all the time. Another was precision strike weapons. And those things together, we generally had a monopoly on all of the ones except information technology, because nobody else had drones at that point, or precision strike weapons and night vision. But the biggest difference in the fight was how we would leverage that information technology. So my command was across 27 countries, 76 different bases, trying to fight this one big network enemy. And we learned that the speed of war in modern days, at that point in 2003, was 24 hours. You had to change how you fought every 24 hours. You had to resynchronize every 24 hours. And that was completely different than anything we've ever done before. So we had to use technology to allow us to do that, but in doing that, it made us change our processes to leverage that. It made us change our culture to do that. And those are cataclysmic things, particularly for a very good organization, because a good organization doesn't want to change because they're already world class. So from 2003 to 2008, I commanded this task force, and within a year or so of me taking command, I had better capabilities than any military commander in history. I would sit in command centers, and we had them all over the place. We had 17 of them in Iraq alone, and we had them in the Horn of Africa, Pakistan, Afghanistan, and whatnot. And in every one of these, there would be 12 or so big flat-screen TVs. There would be all these different linkages. We could connect to all of our command every moment. We could see the battlefield because we had incredible coverage with then Predator drones that were above full motion video. I mean, we could do all of this stuff with a speed and a precision that Napoleon would have killed for. And it changed the nature of how we operated. And so we became faster, we became flatter. As described in a book, Team of Teams, we changed our operating model and culture so that we were able to constantly adapt. The idea was constantly adapt, push decision-making way down to the lowest level so be even faster. And when I took command, we were doing 4 raids a month, 1 a week. 2 years later, we were doing 300 raids a month, 10 a night. And we kept that pace up for 2.5 more years, every week, every month, every year. And so it was a fundamental shift in the way military forces. Now, we were uniquely resourced, so we were ahead of most organizations. But the reality was it was this clear picture of the future. Now, I think we're at a point that we're an inflection point that is probably even bigger than that.
Right, we got potential of drones, what we've seen happen in Ukraine. We've got AI. We have weaponization on social media
Right.
at a whole nother level. We have potential of different
Right.
kinetic technologies. And so how do you think about, what's your advice to people with what's coming?
Well, 2 points. The first is the difference between then and now is everybody's got that. Not just nation states, organizations, individuals can do cyber, they can do precision strike weapons, they can buy or build a drone, they can do all of the things that we had the monopoly on, and they can do it on a small scale very cheaply. So you've had the democratization of technology, which means we're now not just the hunter, we're the hunted. If we watch what happened in Iran when the Israelis put a base with drones inside the country and then launched them, or what the Ukrainians did when they moved drones in basically 18-foot trailers, anybody could do that to us. And so we are probably more vulnerable. So it changes the nature of the fight. AI, I think, is even bigger than that. That changes the physical nature of the fight, how you can move, what you can see, what you can hit. Because anything you can find now, you can hit with a weapon. And with proliferation of drones, the Ukrainians are going to manufacture more than 1 million drones this year, Ukraine itself. So you start to get an idea of the numbers. That changes the battlefield there. But the AI part, and I was talking to my colleague this morning, I think this summer is when AI suddenly changes. And the reason I say that, and of course you'd know better, is because I work with a bunch of companies. I've got my own company. We've been talking about AI. We've been investing in stuff like that. Just this summer, we're now using it. Everybody in the company's using it. Even people who don't think about AI aren't doing big things. Everybody's just using it. And once everybody starts using it, it was like, remember 20, 30 years ago when, maybe your kids got on the internet and that was kind of a curiosity. Then suddenly there was a point where you had to get on the internet to buy stuff.
Wikipedia shows up.
That's right.
eBay.
It's not
Amazon.
a choice anymore.
Right.
I think this summer is when it's happening right now. And if we go to October, we're going to find a fundamental shift in how we all interact with AI, which is going to accelerate it much more because you have more people thinking about it, figuring out uses. And that's going to be the same way in military operations.
All right, so I want to jump into questions. Which end of the pool do you want to jump in?
Either
Deep
way.
end or the shallow?
Make it hard.
All right, let's go with the deep end. So the natural question at hand right now is current events.
Yeah.
There's current events across many forms. I think everyone's eye is right now just by the domination, is dominated right now by the Middle East, what's happening in Iran.
Yeah.
Surprisingly, how fast Ukraine has fallen off that view.
Yeah.
But I think the set of questions here that are on people's mind is, how do you think of the landscape, especially through conflict that's happening around the world? If we were doing around the world, because we got North Korea, we got stuff happening in LATAM, it's a pretty, we've forgotten about Taiwan somehow all of a sudden. So maybe take us in your mind as you do around the world.
Yeah, sure. First thing is the world is not worse than it's ever been. It's not the most dangerous time ever. I just don't buy that. We go back to the period of the Cold War. People got within 30 seconds of midnight and several times we almost did destroy the world. You had two big blocs that could do it and seemed to want to do it at times. You go back before that to the Second World War when we had the Axis who were trying to take over huge swaths. That was more dangerous. Both of those periods were more dangerous. And arguably there were times before that in history. So this is not the most dangerous. But this is a irritatingly dangerous time. And yeah. And it's kind of unstructured because
That's a great op-ed.
Yeah. You know, we got to the end of history in 1989 when Fukuyama wrote the book, The End of History, and said, two countries with McDonald's will never have war again, and there's all these ideas that we're in a postmodern world. Well, that turned out not to be true, and instead people still want to go to war, they still want to argue, we still have the rise of autocratic leaders. So we're going through a period with a rise of dangerously autocratic leaders. At the same time, we're going through this incredible buying spree of military equipment, and typically when you buy military equipment, there's a temptation to use it. And so it feels more like the 1930s, and that's dangerous. So we've got to be better than we were in the 1930s. If we go back and look at the 30s, our diplomacy wasn't that good. We were weak. Some of our allies were weak. We just did a bunch of things that allowed or enabled some of those threats to get bigger than they should have gotten. And we paid a great price for it. And I think in that way, it's very similar. And so if that's the playing field, the United States is still in pretty good shape in terms of economically and military capability. We're as good as we want to be, or we're as mediocre as we allow ourselves to be. Our great existential threat is internal. As Abraham Lincoln said, nobody's ever going to conquer the United States. We're going to die by suicide. And we're trying to do that right now. We are literally trying to rip ourselves apart, and that's weakening us tremendously. But we haven't yet. If we look around the world at the big threats, China is the one with the most capability to change their way of life, both economically, and they're building military capability. They got a 71-year-old president for life who said he's going to take Taiwan on his watch. And so there's an idea. I don't think that China will attack Taiwan. Now, I could be wrong this afternoon, but I don't think it's in their interest to do that. They've watched what happened in Ukraine and Gaza. Wars are ugly. They're hard to control. And if China got in a war with Taiwan, even if they captured it and then the world made them a pariah, China is a market-requiring economy. And so if they didn't have access to world markets, they would have a real problem. So I think they'd rather get in a position where they increase their capability and then they cause us to doubt our will to defend Taiwan. And then one day they get a president of the United States to go, well, you know, we'd like to maintain Taiwan's independence, but you know, China's got a point. And once that happens, Taiwan goes, oh, shit. And then they start to say, we better accommodate. And then you get on a road like Hong Kong.
Well, that door was closed very firmly closed, locked, and taped shut.
I'm not sure.
Now it's open.
That's right.
It's like, you know, you could argue the
Right.
degrees of it's definitely unlocked. Maybe open a crack to open a
Right.
lot. And I think this comes into a number of the questions that are political commentary of how you think about our leaders and I think it's easy to comment on just the political nature.
Sure.
But I think it might be more interesting to talk about their thinking
Right.
and their thought process to get to the decision making, that where we have troops at the end, at that tip of the spear who are taking action.
Right.
And how do you think about, and so maybe you could tell us a little bit through your eyes of how you see that evolving and how you think about it.
Yeah, so what question?
feel
Are
like
we
I
still
should've brought
going around the world, or do you want me
Or,
to?
well, let's okay, fair enough. We've only covered a couple continents.
No,
keep going. Like, why don't we go take a little, like, let's spend 2 more minutes on that, and then let's
sure.
jump.
Yeah. Okay, well, we'll go to Ukraine, and I think we blew that one. We haven't blown it completely, but we are trying to. Russia is much weaker than we think they are, and they have been from the beginning. They're not the Soviet Union anymore. We should have enabled Ukraine to adequately defend themselves from day one. We should have given them a blank check. and just let them, because I think it would have caused Putin to fail, which I think would have caused regime change, which, people say, well, you never know what you're going to get. Well, we couldn't get much worse. So I think that's what we should have done. Unfortunately, for a while, it looked like Russia was about to win. Now, not too sure again, so we'll see. But I think that's what we should do there. In the Mideast, the map is completely different with the destruction of Hezbollah. We used to be terrified of Hezbollah. We used to say that we were fighting al-Qaeda, but if we really want to get in a big one, it would be with Hezbollah. Mm-hmm. And then they turned out to be more brittle than we thought. Iran has turned out to be more brittle than we thought. But Iran,
good call, bad call?
I don't know. I mean, I'm conflicted. I don't think it was good that Israel hijacked our foreign policy, because they basically put us in a position we could only do one thing. There wasn't a choice not to strike, because they create the opportunity, and if we didn't, any president who didn't take the chance to knock out that thing would have a tough time politically. So I resent that, and I think it might turn out to be a mistake. But we are where we are. The key thing now is Iran's going to continue to exist. There are 92 million Iranians. So the best thing I heard this morning is there is a lot of talk of parallel negotiations going on. There's one school of thought that says you knock somebody down, and then Machiavelli would say, go on and kill him and bury the corpse. And I don't think that's the case, because you're not going to kill Iran. Mm-hmm. What you're trying to do is create a dynamic where Iran will come back to the table, maybe come into the community of nations. It won't be immediate, but maybe you can open a door where it makes sense for them to come back. The one idea I'd plant with everybody before we shift to the other thing is, if we were Iranian citizens, even if we didn't like the Ayatollah or the current regime, most of us in this room would want the country to have a nuclear weapon. And you say, no, we wouldn't. Yeah, we would. Because countries that have nuclear weapons have better security. We don't screw with North Korea now. Pakistan, India, the ones that have it, whether we wanted them to get it or not. The people who gave it up, Ukraine, Libya, it didn't work well for them. So if I was an Iranian citizen, I would very much want my country to have nuclear weapons. I wouldn't want them to use them or be irresponsible, but I'd want them. So we need to not simplify the issue by saying you've got Ayatollah Khamenei and he's a hardhead and he wants nukes.
Right.
They are a sovereign nation that wants security.
Well, this gets to that point of clarity of thought,
Yeah.
and being able to understand this. And when you see both our politicians and the people who've been put into key leadership roles,
Yeah.
in that process, I think a number of the questions naturally are your thoughts on the political nature of
Yeah.
and dynamics in the country right now.
Yeah, I think they're unfortunate, and I'll hit a couple things. I think the cabinet's weak, and I think that the Republican Party has abrogated their responsibility to be a balance against their own president, because they're given a blank check. And our system's not designed to give blank checks. And so we didn't want to concentrate that much power in a single person, because we've learned through history around the world that doesn't work very well. Even if they're a good person initially, it almost never works long term. So I think that's a real problem. If you want to worry about something, and obviously I would, the military, that you can do a lot of things with the military, you can use them incorrectly, et cetera, and that's unfortunate. One of the most disturbing has been the firing of military people for political reasons. Now, you can fire generals all you want for incompetence, for whatever they do, and that's sometimes a responsibility. But if you fire them for political reasons, we're in a place we've never been before in American history. And you say, well, okay, well, it's kind of a problem. Here's where it's a problem. You fire a few to scare the rest, and it works. Even though they're good people, they will worry for their job, and they're trying to figure out how to deal with this. They want to be loyal. They want to be, at the same time, they want to do what's right, and they're going through a hellish calculation of what they do. And younger generations watch this, And if this becomes the norm, the younger generations will become a different kind of military. They will be politicized younger because they will figure out that's how you progress in the military. And a generation from now, we'll have a different military, and we won't like it. And that is extraordinarily painful. And someone says, well, why doesn't the military fix the problem? Why don't they stand up to him? They can't do that. That's not their position. The military is supposed to stay apolitical and technocratically effective. It's our responsibility. They're not supposed to say no to the president. They're not, if the president gives a lawful order, they're supposed to do it. But when we, the rest of America, sees things happening that are wrong, we have to stand up. It's unfair to ask the military to do it. So, I mean, if you ask the military to do it long enough, we'll wake up one morning and there'll be a coup.
Yeah. I'm glad you said this because, I would encourage everyone to especially read the chapter on patriotism. But I think one of the things to highlight here is we're willing to put a bumper sticker in our car that says support our troops.
Right.
Where are we in the support of these decisions? Some of the questions that came up here, people are saying, well, troops fire on demonstrators. What's the role in the deployment? We're here in California. We're obviously dealing with the nature of these things. I think of also, just to be fully on the record, there's a number of these generals who are heroes, personal heroes. You trained many of them. These are really good people. And I can't even imagine the challenges someone like General Smith or others are in this moment in time.
Right.
And so maybe the question I think which is there is, what can we do to truly support our troops and make sure that when we are looking back, we say, yeah, you know what, we had the character right now to do the right things to ensure we have the military fighting force that we expect.
I don't have a perfect answer for you. I think that's what's got to happen. There's got to be a political pushback. And it should come from all Americans, not just from, political leaders, some of whom would be viewed as opportunists trying to take advantage of it. But we have got to say that's not what we want as a military. I mean, if we have military troops in the streets and they kill other Americans, pretty soon people are going to identify U.S. military kind of like the redcoats. They'll be the enemy. And one, you're not going to do much recruiting of the right kind of people in the future. Second, it's a dynamic you don't want. That's why we've never.
We're watching that happen with ICE right now.
Yeah.
You're watching pushback. You're watching people who now just arbitrarily say a portion of the federal government is wrong, and that's scary if we enter the military into that framework.
Yeah.
What's the advice you give to military leaders?
Yeah. There is, and I talk to a lot of them, and I basically say you got to follow your heart. Most of them really want the best. They've got great values, want the best thing. They're trying to stay loyal. They're trying to protect the force. They're trying not to be pulled into doing something that is wrong. But again, there are a lot of orders that are lawful that are wrong. Mm-hmm. And that's the problem. The military is not allowed to decide whether they're right or wrong. They decide if they're lawful and they follow them. And so, I don't have real sage wisdom. That's why it's got to come from the American people to protect the U.S. military so that the U.S. military can protect us in the way that they're supposed to. And I think that is maybe the biggest point that worries me. That's the thing that makes America the most vulnerable. It's that kind of a trend because we think we're exceptional. Well, why are we exceptional? We're not. We're only as good as we are today. As I tell people, they go, well, what about the founding fathers? I say they're all dead. We are as good as we decide to be or as mediocre as we allow ourselves to be. And it starts again every day. And that's the thing about it. We coast a little bit. We can't imagine that we could go the way of the Weimar Republic and drift into National Socialism. We say it's impossible. We're America. Who knows what could happen? What we do know is that there's nothing guarantees the success of our democracy. Mm-hmm. We have to
earn it every day.
That's right.
Right.
Exactly.
So in our remaining little bit of time, I want to ask you, how you fight cynicism every day when you get up and you see the news, you see what's happening.
Yeah.
How do you do it?
And it's so easy for people, particularly at our age, to start to get cynical because, you assume everybody's not as good as we were and that sort of thing, and they're screwing it up, and they think we screwed it up. And you think that there are problems that we took on, like Afghanistan in my case, you took on, it rhymed with Vietnam and had kind of the same tragic outcome, and you say, well, okay, here we go. And there's no point in doing it, of trying to do anything if it's not going to come out the way we want it to. But where I step back to is, I think President Obama said something that I really like the quote. He says, just because we can't do everything doesn't mean we shouldn't do something. And I think that when I step back and say, we can make a difference, and there are a lot of people willing to step up and do the right thing, and we don't have a choice. I mean, I got my granddaughters. They've got a lot more of life ahead of them than I do, but the reality is I owe them something. And, there's a lot of good young people, and I think they're going to figure it out. Now, they'll have their own issues, but I think they'll figure it out, and I'm just hoping that these current challenges we have, I think we'll realize that we have control. This is the thing that's funny. Right now we're thinking, all this is going on. Hey, we have control. We have agency. We have votes. We have money to contribute. We have all of these things, but we kind of don't realize how powerful we are.
We've given it away.
That's right. Exactly.
Given away. What's the advice that you have for people in this moment as we're in this time where people are starting to protest, and it doesn't matter what political spectrum you're on here. Not making this a political statement.
Yeah.
Part of what makes us great is when we engage.
Yeah.
When we try to bring people together, and some of that can happen in different forms. How do you bring people together to actually have that discussion for us to collectively figure it out?
Yeah, I think there are two parts to that. The first is, if you're trying to get something done, get organized, think it through. Study the American Civil Rights Movement. And Tom Ricks wrote a brilliant book about that. We used a military analogy to study the strategy of it. It really was well fought, and it was very disciplined in its execution because the task was so hard. And look at the Tea Party, different organizations that get what they want, the Bolsheviks who hijacked the Russian Revolution. It's a group of people who decide what they want, they focus, and they go. And if it's a good thing, then it's positive. So the first is, I wouldn't just go out in the street and start, burning Teslas or anything like that. I would be organized with one. But then the other part is talking, because the reality is the people on the other side are just as rational as you are. And that's the one that kind of, even terrorists, I deal with these terrorists that they were an anathema to everything that I believed in. I'm trying to kill them and vice versa. But the reality is they were dedicated, they were loyal to their cause, they were courageous. They were all the things I looked in for the people that I served alongside. They just had a different life journey. And if I'd had their life journey, I'd probably have been in their side. And so once you start with that recognition, then you kind of go, well, they got a point. And that's why I sometimes describe our challenges with Iran by asking people to look at Iranian history from 1953 to now through their eyes. And it's a different view. And you don't have to agree with it. But if you understand it, then you suddenly realize that they're not a bunch of nutcases who just don't pay attention. They've had an experience that drew them to certain conclusions, and we got to admit that.
Right. Well, we're here at the end of our time, and so I first want to thank Annie and you both, because as we know, it's not just the person in uniform that serves, it's the entire family that serves. So I just want to take a moment and thank both of you. Not only for your service, public service, but also for your leadership, writing this book, For those that are here today, thank you for being here. Those that are online, thank you for being online with us. I encourage you all to pick up a copy of General McChrystal's book here at the Commonwealth Club or your local bookstore. I encourage you to become a member of the Commonwealth Club if you're not a member. And information about the Commonwealth Club, World Affairs membership, and upcoming programs, please visit www.commonwealthclub.org. I'm DJ Patil. Thank you, General McChrystal. Thank you, and take care. Thank you.